Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to ozcastnetwork.com for details.
Thank you for downloading and listening to This Pathological Life. If you're interested in continuing the story, we have a second series called This Medical Life. Please download it and subscribe now.
Dr. Travis Brown, why do we need a podcast called This Pathological Life?
Every disease has its own story to tell. So we're going to tell them.
Also created asbestos cement roofing, which has made buildings safer and more durable. This material, available in many types and colors, is not only attractive, but fireproof too. This same kind of scientific thinking was applied to the problem of sidewalls for the homes of America. In the development of a better siding material, rigid specifications were set up. It must be attractive, easy to handle, adjustable to architectural design, weatherproof, and rot-proof. Furthermore, it must be safe from the hazards of fire, and above all, free from constant maintenance expense.
Made for lifetime use.
There's something profoundly disturbing when a product in society that we have relied upon and taken for granted turns out to be something very dangerous and damaging, blindsiding many of us. And that product we're talking about in this episode is asbestos and the condition we know as mesothelioma. Travis, where does this story begin?
In February of 2001, I was working in business in Melbourne at the time, and an unusual occurrence happened. The organisation James Hardie, which was an asbestos manufacturer, had been since the 1930s. Share price was increasing. They had just announced the Medical Research and Compensation Foundation, which was an organisation set up to compensate workers, their own workers who had been exposed and injured due to asbestos, and they had made an announcement.
Sufficient funds to meet all legitimate compensation claims anticipated from people injured by asbestos products that were manufactured in the past by two former subsidiaries.
So what the organisation had done is it had created this organisation as a means to fund asbestos claims coming through. They absolved themselves of any liability. They passed it all over to this organisation. James Hardie in 2001 had around $2 billion on their books, sales of $1.5 billion, and they're an asbestos manufacturer. And their share price was increasing at a time when in the 1980s and 1990s, organisations that are asbestos manufacturers were going bankrupt and out of business because of claims from workers because of it. They put $239 million into this foundation, washed their hands of it, and then their share price was going up. And I couldn't quite work it out. And then in August of 2001, 98% of the shareholders agreed that this organisation can move offshore to the Netherlands to take advantage of a tax haven in the US-Netherlands Treaty. And so they left this foundation. Even at the time, it was known that was nowhere near enough money. And I couldn't quite work it out because I saw investors saying, this is an organisation we want to be a part of a bit more. Clearly enough, the money was nowhere near enough. And in 6 years later, the government stepped in and got an amount of $4 billion to adequately compensate injuries. I mean, that's 6 years. And I just remember thinking the share price is going up when they're doing something clearly wrong. They're almost being rewarded for bad behaviour. And so when you start to dig a little bit deeper, you realise James Hardie is just in a queue of misbehaving organisations. There's a long queue there, and asbestos is in the mix. So if we look at when asbestos started to become an industrial mineral that was used. We're talking about the mid-1800s to late 1800s. And this is where it started to be in manufacturing and mining. But the conditions were very different. They were working in an environment where visibility was a few meters due to asbestos fibres.
That is nightmarish itself. That portends to what was to come later.
Exactly. But the other thing is, because they didn't know about it, and this was a relatively new industrial use of it, most of them died of what they thought was consumption, so TB, in the lungs. But they were getting so much fibrosis, they were dying because of, well, clearly what we know now. So we start to get evidence going through in 1900 by Dr. H. Montague Murray, who noticed a young worker in an asbestos factory had lung tissue destroyed by these asbestos needles. Then corporate America, or corporate US, started to understand, and in 1918, the New York Prudential Life Insurance ceased insuring asbestos workers with life insurance. So they started to know that early.
1918.
1918. In 1924, we've got William Cook, who does a report on fibrosis of the lungs due to inhale asbestos dust. So the medical community is starting to cotton on here. But the problem is, so is the asbestos industry. And they get, in 1929, a doctor from the Metropolitan Life Insurance, assistant medical director by the name of Dr. Anthony Lanza, to come in and investigate lung disease in their workers. And what does he find? He finds that 50% of textile workers have lung disease by 5 to 10 years. That increases to 90% when they're there for 15 years. But remember, he's a medical insurance. So there was a plant doctor who said, should we put up warnings? And his answer is no, because it will create a potential legal situation. The results were suppressed. So in 1932, we've got US companies, Asbestos Manhattan and Johns Manville, starting to modify studies. And we've got, in 1933, British company, Turner and Newell, starting to influence governments to limit the regulations they're putting on asbestos. And in 1935, we're starting to get the first reports where a doctor by the name of Stephen Gloyn, a London pathologist, reported a case of lung cancer and suggested that asbestos was a possible link to mesothelioma. And then we get a classic 1935 company lawyer, like the president writes to a company lawyer and says,
"The less said about asbestos, the better off we are."
And as the years are going by, more and more countries are listing asbestos as an occupational disease. At the same time this is happening, so in the 1930s, 40s, the Metropolitan Life Insurance Company becomes a major insurer for asbestos industry and starts to be able to limit safety inspections in the organisation. Come 1948, we've got a doctor by the name of Dr. Kenneth Smith who writes a memo to Johns Manville head office, so this is an asbestos manufacturer, about 7 workers' x-ray about them having asbestosis. And he wrote,
"As long as the man is not disabled, it's felt that he should not be told of his condition, so that he can live and work in peace, and the company can benefit by his many years of experience."
So the president not only agreed, it became company policy that workers were not to be told about when they were sick or even when they were becoming sicker. And more countries are now listing this. You know, Switzerland, Austria asbestos is an occupational disease. And then the linkage is made in 1962 by Dr. Irving Slenikoff who linked asbestos with life-threatening diseases, including cancer. In 1966, we've got the Bendix Corporation executive who wrote in a memorandum,
My answer to the problem is, if you've enjoyed a good life while working with asbestos products, why not die from it? There's got to be some cause.
So in 1970s, the industry creates an Asbestos Information Association of North America. This is effectively a lobbying organisation used to restrict or limit the amount of government regulations in their industry. And oddly enough, this is about the time, so that's happening in the US. In Australia, the 70s or 80s, this is when we're hitting our peak with regards to asbestos being an insulation product. So there is, advertisements of Mr. Fluffy and asbestos fluff being put into insulation building materials. And by the time of 1982, the organisation Johns Manville files for bankruptcy. And then in 1988, Johns Manville emerged from bankruptcy to establish the Manville Personal Injury Settlement Trust for $2.5 billion. In 1989, the EPA for America announced plans to phase out all asbestos industries and a ban of new use of asbestos. And true to form, in 1991, the US courts reversed that ban. It's still used in the US today, and there's quite a number of manufacturers, main ones being places like Russia, but asbestos was only banned in Australia in 2003. Just to put it into context, the Mansfield Personal Injury Settlement Trust for $2.5 billion set in 1988, if we just look back at the books of Johns Manville, in 1974 they made $1 billion worth of sales, upwards of $1 billion.
In 1974.
So if you equate how much that is, that's the same amount that they put into a trust in 1988 to compensate workers. So 1 year's worth of sales is their compensation fund for an organisation that's been running for over 100 years at that time.
It's certainly haunting to think back of the willful way it was pushed through and hushed up.
Volcanoes millions of years ago resulted in the formation of a deposit called olivine. As the years passed, it became covered with successive layers of earth. Then the rains came. Below ground, the olivine absorbed the water and swelled, like gelatine. Eventually it dried out, leaving cracks and crevices which made a sort of rock matrix or mold. The silk-like fibres that grew in the cracks were the material from which asbestos was made. So you see, the remarkable fire-resisting, sound-insulating product known as asbestos is not a vegetable fibre, but a mineral, a piece of rock.
In its heyday and in a prolonged way through beyond its virtuous shelf life, there was something about asbestos, wasn't it, as a miracle product?
Absolutely. So it was one of those things that I didn't realise. Growing up, I knew about it had insulation properties, but I didn't know until looking into it how amazing asbestos is, and I can understand why it's been used so much. The term asbestos is a Greek term, and it means indestructible or eternal. And asbestos has a silk-like quality. So the softness, but it's actually a mineral. It's an inorganic element, and it's made up of different compositions with regards to calcium, magnesium, silicate, and it's naturally occurring. It's able to be mined, and they have soft, flexible fibres. Now, it's put into two categories. One's short fibres with regards to short, jagged or straight, and one's curly. One's called amphibole, is the straight, jagged type, and there's 5 different types in there. You'll talk about crocodilite, which is blue, and amosite, which is brown. There's 3 others. And then you've got the other one, which is called serpentine, which is crystallite, which is also known as the white asbestos. And a lot of the times, the white has been used significantly in past production. The properties are quite amazing. It's resistant to fire, to heat, electrical, chemical. It has a melting point of 1,500 degrees centigrade. When we look at the ancient uses, they noted this because the Greek geographer Strabo noted a strange cloth. So they were making it all the way back then. And when it got dirty, to clean it, they would throw it into the fire.
Oh, wow.
And so then they'll take it out and it was clean. It would be white. And then we got Pliny the Elder, who's a Roman historian, who noted that asbestos tablecloths were fire resistant, and they could even make royal shrouds. So you would actually have them as crematorial wrappings, put the body in to the fire, and then because it was resistant, you would have the ashes that were separate from the flames, as from the wood, and be able to use them.
Probably the only person for whom use of asbestos was safe was that person being cremated.
Exactly. Slaves were the people who would mine asbestos, and there was a sickness of the lungs that these slaves would get. And even Pliny the Elder noted that some of the slaves would wear a thin membrane across their face, which was made of either the bladder of a goat or a lamb to protect themselves from the fibres. You can understand when it hits the industrial age that this is a remarkable miracle product that is fire resistant. There is advertisements shown of men having asbestos gowns, jumping into fire to put it out because they're protected by these fibres. Unfortunately, there is no safe level of exposure. So whilst these amazing properties are incredible, have durable abilities, it's not safe because if you inhale the fibres, it can be toxic to you. So if we look at the industrial age of asbestos, in 1910 we have 128,000 tonnes being mined. By the mid-50s and 70s, that's up to 3 to 5 million tonnes of asbestos being mined and sold. At that time, over 3,000 products use it. The problem with that is the workers are getting sick. It's a long latent period, but there's significant morbidity and mortality associated with it. If we look at today, the largest exporters are Russia, Kazakhstan, and Brazil. We have 3 of the largest importers are India, China, and Indonesia. There is OC health and safety rules in areas such as the US about exposure levels. We're talking about 0.1, what they call fibres per cubic centimetre in the air, and you can only have exposure for that for 8 hours. We're talking people past exposures were up to 700 in a mine. And unfortunately, it still exists in homes today as an insulation from the past.
This again is a reminder of the importance of history, isn't it? Because without understanding that deep past, you kind of had rose-coloured glasses and you can think, well, of course everyone would have been swept up, but we knew about this much longer than has been popularly accepted. Wow. Let's call Dr Fergus Whitehead in from Clinpath because he has some expertise to share on this topic.
In my second day in the job, the dad of a girl I went to school with, he was a ship's electrician. He tells me to watch out for the asbestos dust. So I asked my boss, he was a big man, you know, with jet black hair. that you only saw when he was at the Barrowland dancing because it was grey with dust most of the time. But I asked him about the dust and he said, it's fine. He said, it's the blue stuff you've got to watch out for. He said, the white stuff's fine. In fact, he had it in good authority for a doctor at the Turner Newell factory where they made the stuff, that the magnesia in the dust was actually good for your stomach. Aye, breathe it in, son, he said. Let that magnesia do its stuff.
We're now joined in the studio for the last part of this episode by Dr Fergus Whitehead, Clinpath CEO, and also with a special interest in histopathology relating to the lung. Welcome, Fergus.
Thank you for having me.
Fergus, how common is asbestos and asbestos-related disease in Australia?
In Australia, it's quite a common disease. In fact, the malignancy related to asbestos, mesothelioma, is the death rate for that is the second highest in the world. The reason for this is that between the years of 1950 and about 1970, believe it or not, Australians were the highest per capita user of asbestos in the world. One of the most common areas where asbestos was mined was Western Australia with the Wittenoon mine, you may remember, which relates to James Hardie, of course, that large company which produced many products from asbestos, which was obviously involved in construction, sheeting, roofing, guttering, and all sorts of other supplies relating to plumbing and electronics. And between the years of 1930 and 1966, in Western Australia, where the peak incidence of asbestos-related diseases, that's where the blue asbestos was mined, which is the asbestos specifically related to mesothelioma.
The distribution across Australia then, so it's mainly in Western Australia?
Mainly in Western Australia. However, white asbestos was mined in New South Wales. But the blue asbestos is more potent in causing asbestos-related diseases, and obviously the incidence of those diseases were more in Western Australia, but and least of all in Tasmania, where they obviously didn't mine very much asbestos. It has a fairly long latency period, asbestos, so you're exposed to it, but it takes years for you to get the symptoms of the diseases.
Well, my dad was a builder in that period of time.
Yes.
And so he's just turned 80. I think he hasn't shown any symptoms yet. What are the presentations for people with asbestos-related?
Well, there's basically the symptoms, because you can get fibrosis of the lung, so that's asbestosis, or you can develop malignancy in the pleura, which is mesothelioma, and there's also a higher incidence of lung cancer of all types, with asbestos as well. And so the main symptoms are shortness of breath, so first obviously on exercise and then just at rest, and chest pain are the main symptoms related to asbestos diseases. So shortness of breath and exercise intolerance.
So the main people who are at risk then are the workers?
The workers. And particularly those workers who, in their job, facilitate dust being produced from the products contaminated with asbestos.
So it's cutting,
drilling, planing, sawing, all those sorts of jobs. And, of course, the main industries, which wouldn't be a surprise to you, would be obviously tradespeople involved in construction, plumbers, gas fitters, also in shipbuilding and automotive maintenance industries. So any industry where there is using the asbestos-impregnated products and causing friction to that and being exposed to the dust.
So yet again, when first presenting to a GP, taking that history becomes all important.
Occupational history in patients presenting with pulmonary disease, particularly in the age group where they would have had the opportunity to work with asbestos, is very important.
Right. There's a bit of confusion for myself as a junior doctor. Seen lots of X-rays where they talk about pleural plaques.
Yes.
Now, are they always related to...
No, pleural plaques are not always related to asbestos disease, but are commonly associated with it. But interestingly, you don't find the actual asbestos within the pleural plaques, but you do within the lung fibrosis. And the plaques themselves often present with, if that's all you have, present with no symptoms, possibly a small pleural effusion, that's fluid around the lung, but usually asymptomatic.
Looking at the pathogenesis, do we know why lung cancer and mesothelioma developed?
I don't think there's a specific pathogenic or what the actual mechanism is known, but as far as I'm aware, the pathogenesis relates to the fact that the asbestos fibres, particularly the short ones, the amphiboles, get into the lung tissue and they can't be removed by the body. So inflammation is set up and causes a chronic irritation now. And during inflammation, oxygen-free radicals are produced, which cause damage to DNA, and accumulated damage to DNA over a period of time causes cancer, causes the malignancy.
Do we know the prognosis, first of all, for pleural plaques? Does everyone who have a pleural plaque develop asbestosis, or does it go forward?
No, not everybody who develops pleural plaques will develop asbestosis, but a lot of the pathology related to asbestosis is related specifically to how much they've been exposed and the particular type of asbestos they're exposed to. So if it's the short fibres like the amphiboles like crocodilite, which was mined in Wittenoom mine, that is quite pathogenic, and if there's high exposure, particularly the miners, you imagine the miners would have been exposed every day, they are more likely to develop the disease. As I said, you don't find the asbestos fibres within the pleural plaques, but you do within the lung, and obviously the more exposed, the more fibres you find, and the quicker the disease can progress. So really the diseases which cause morbidity or patient problems are the fibrosis associated with which is asbestosis, and then obviously the malignancies that can occur.
So is asbestosis almost a chronic disease that someone will live?
Sorry, it's a chronic disease. Usually the people start developing symptoms 10 to 15 years after their exposure, and maybe 20 years, and then it's a chronic disease with progressive fibrosis of the lung.
Then there is obviously an element that people progress to lung cancer or mesothelioma. So is there a percentage, or do we know how many people are at risk who have asbestosis that will go to there?
I can't give you a specific figure, but it's a significant percentage higher than the normal, particularly if the patient is a smoker. So the two risk factors combine. I mean, a patient who has pulmonary fibrosis of other causes can also has a higher risk of developing lung cancer as well. It is significantly higher risk than the normal population.
The prognosis for mesothelioma?
Very poor, because it's not amenable to surgery, because it involves the pleura, so you can't just remove the pleura and excise the tumour. And B, the tumour has very little sensitivity to usual chemotherapy agents. One of the reasons is that it's usually not a highly proliferative tumour, which means, cancer chemotherapy works on the fact that tumour cells are very proliferative and knocks them off or kills them in preference to normal cells. And there hasn't been many breakthroughs as there has been in lung cancer, such as with immunotherapy and targeted molecules, that there has been in mesothelioma.
Does that mean just the passing of time and the distance from when asbestos was so prolifically in our society, that this disease is going to gradually disappear?
The incidence has probably peaked. There's been around 10,000 deaths in Australia from asbestos-related disease, principally mesothelioma, since about 1980. And the prediction is, obviously it peaked in around 2014, where there were 770 cases and around 670 deaths. But over the next 40 years, it's predicted there will be another 25,000 patients over that time. So because of the long latency period, we are going to experience this disease for many years to come. But at some point, when the cohort of people exposed are no longer with us, then the incidence will fall.
Certainly we're hoping that there's no other building products in our society lurking.
No, and of course there are still houses out there at the moment that have been built that still have asbestos in, and if you've got any an old house that you think might have asbestos in, it's very important you try and get the experts in to remove it, because really men get their diseases from exposure to the workplace and working with asbestos, but the women, who obviously present a smaller percentage, about 20% of the cases, get it from their husbands coming home and the products that they're exposed to at home. So, but there are still asbestos-containing products out there.
Well, I'm certainly glad that 12 years ago, when we moved into the house I'm in now, and we were ripping up flooring.
Is it bluestone?
Well, yeah, we found some asbestos.
I see.
And I was tempted to prove to my dad that I'm a bloke as well, and I was going to rip it up, and I thought, no, we'll err on the side of caution.
Yes,
There's been enough in the media.
Very good choice.
Thank goodness for that.
Very good choice.
Thank you for joining us, Dr. Fergus Whitehead.
No problem.
This Pathological Life is produced by Clinpath Pathology in South Australia. Episode notes, references and learning objectives, when applicable, can be found at thispathologicallife.com.au. And you can contact the hosts on Twitter via @Dr Travis Brown or @Steve Davis. Thanks again for listening, and just a reminder, if you haven't done it yet, have a quick search in your podcast app for our second series, This Medical Life. Dr. Travis Brown has rolled up some extra guests, some extra topics, and we continue the story there, and we'd love to have you along.
Love this podcast? Support it and sponsor today. Simply head to AuscastNetwork.com for details.